President Zelensky, speaking Friday in Kiev, said that there is insufficient evidence of an imminent invasion. He talked of his concern about Western authorities creating panic. What is your read of the current situation on the ground? What does NATO see on the ground in front of it?
Well, thanks. I think what NATO sees is a country, Russia, building up its forces on the border with Ukraine. It claims that it has no intent to invade, but it cannot answer the question why it's assembling 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine. So the alliance is concerned. Many members of the alliance are concerned, and we're taking a two-track approach. We're keeping the door open to dialogue, but we are also preparing for other contingencies.
And we should note, Ambassador, that Russia's UN envoy speaking at that Security Council meeting disputes that 100,000 troops are now on the Ukraine border. But speaking of troop movement, the U.S. has announced it's moving 8,500 more troops to Eastern Europe. If they're not being deployed to Ukraine specifically, why is that so important? And does that risk further provoking Russia?
Well, there's two things going on. So what the United States recently announced is that we are going to put 8,500 troops that are part of the NATO response force on high alert. That means they'll be ready to deploy on a moment's notice should we need those forces anywhere in Europe to protect NATO territory. In addition, the United States is also looking at possible additional moves that they might make to move U.S. force posture into Central and Eastern Europe. The reason we're looking at that is because a lot of the members in that neighborhood in Central and Eastern Europe feel concerned. And so we are looking at what measures we might take in the name of reassurance and deterrence.
Ambassador, you talk about these troops being on high alert. How long can they stay on high alert for? And what is your sense of the timing in terms of how events are likely to unfold?
Well, I think we all would love to be inside President Putin's head and understand what his actual intent is. We don't believe that he has taken the decision yet about whether or not he's going to go into Ukraine, but we do continue to see a buildup. He is not de-escalating. At one point, he had claimed he was de-escalating, that they were moving forces back. That's not the case. That's not what we're seeing. And for that reason, we do have that decision that the U.S. wants to keep those forces on alert. And that's something we can do for quite some time. I don't think any of us are worried about that, but that those troops will be ready should we need them to defend NATO territory.
If President Putin doesn't make a move, if this all turns out to just be posturing, Ambassador, where will that leave the relationship between not just the U.S. and Russia, but the broader NATO alliance in Russia?
Well, the relationship between NATO and Russia is in a troubled state. We have had a lot of disagreements in recent years, but the good news is we were able to hold a NATO-Russia Council. It's the first time we were able to hold that in the last 2 years. So we are engaging with Moscow, but we have deep disagreements. They have asked us to allow them to have a veto over NATO enlargement. And frankly, that's just not something that the NATO alliance is prepared to offer. Quite the contrary, what NATO has said is that NATO enlargement is something that rests between the members of the alliance and any aspirant countries.
In terms of what the longer-term position is going to be here, particularly of the United States vis-a-vis European security, what has changed here? Do you think anything has changed here more permanently? There has been a lot of discussion that the United States is de-emphasizing Europe as a theater that it should be concerned about. More of a focus being placed in the South China Sea and the containment, some would argue, of China. How has what is happening right now changed that security assessment, do you think? And do you think it is a short-term shift, or do you think this is a longer-term shift?
Well, look, if you listen to administration officials, they'll continue to tell you that China is the pacing threat and that the United States is focused on the challenges presented by China day in and day out. The United States can certainly walk and chew gum at the same time. Simultaneously, the U.S. is heavily engaged in what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. I don't think at any point the administration suggested that we would spend less time focused on Europe. Europe. In fact, I think in most of the speeches you've seen, the public statements, public documents, all the rest, you've seen the simultaneous emphasis on both Russia and China. And I think that will stay that way for many months to come.
Obviously, there's a difference between members of NATO, between the U.S. and European countries on economic reliance on China, but also on Russia as well. And I'm thinking particularly of Germany here in that energy reliance. Has Berlin been a reliable partner in this alliance as you try to formulate a package that would act as a deterrent to Vladimir Putin on this Ukraine issue?
You know, what's really been remarkable is when we had the NATO-Russia Council meeting, it was 4 hours. We sat across the table with the Russians, and not a single ally, Germany included, was off message. We all agreed on the fundamentals. We all agreed that Russia is the aggressor here. Russia went into Ukraine in 2014. Russia is still in Georgia and Moldova. And all of us delivered one singular message to Russia when they came to Brussels just a couple weeks ago. And I don't see that changing. I think Germany continues to be a strong partner, and I have no question that they will continue to work with the alliance going forward on this response to Russia.
Ambassador, I remember 30 years ago writing an essay at university talking about whether or not the security architecture in Europe would change as a result of the end of the Cold War and whether or not NATO had a role. There was a discussion then, 30 years ago, about whether or not the EU should have its own army. That discussion is still live. Do you think what is happening now is strengthening the case for a shift in that architecture, that the EU should pursue that? Or do you think NATO is delivering on its original remit and its original objective, and it can continue to do so?
Well, NATO was designed to deal, as you know, with the Soviet threat. And so when we're dealing with some of these challenges right now between Russia and Ukraine, I mean, intuitively, I think NATO allies understand what they're dealing with. We're all deeply familiar with the Russian playbook. We understand what tools Putin may try to use to divide us, to intimidate allies, possibly to go into Ukraine or destabilize Ukraine. And so this is territory that we know well. In terms of what the message from the United States to Europe is, we have over many decades asked Europeans to do more, to spend more on defense, to take more responsibility for their own security, and we will continue pressing them on that, whether they're building capacity inside the European Union or working through our preferred institution, the NATO alliance. We're obviously a member of this alliance. We have a unique leadership role there, too.